So, hi and welcome to another episode of Hot Takes with me, the Silver Fox, and this is part 2 of our investigation into the ferries. We're calling this episode the commissioning of the design because this is showing how the whole thing was commissioned from the government into CMAL and so forth all the way down to the end. We'll be looking at the committee. We'll be looking at what it actually asked for and the reasoning behind what it asked for. We'll be looking at how CMAL was brought on board and what was asked of them. And we'll be looking at some of the claims that were made and some of the mistruths that were said at the time of the commissioning. And we're also going to give you an example of some of the lies that were said. And we're going to show you that one of the team members here was not qualified, or at least not properly qualified. I mean, to the point that he over-promoted himself. He made outrageous claims as to his abilities. And he's always pushed these qualifications as being justifiable, when in actual fact they're not. But we will get into them towards the end of this video. So now we will get into this episode and we'll look at what the committee asked for and why. Here goes. So where we have is there's two main issues as to what was requested of these ferries, and what was asked for seems very odd, to say the least. Firstly, with the sort of data that would be obviously and easily available to show passenger numbers and requirements, and secondly, and more technical, which involves the power of these ferries, the engines basically, and what they're going to run on. One of the problems they have is that they specified, and they being the committees, specified that they wanted hulls 801 and 802 to be able to carry approximately 1,000 passengers. Now, in the many years of the previous ferries running these routes, they had on only 2 or maybe 3 occasions at most ever approached anything like those numbers, with the highest number ever recorded being 950. And also, the standard of the passenger accommodation was very highly specified, far too large and plush for journeys that take around 90 minutes to a couple of hours or so, depending on the route. Why so large and why so well appointed? Were CalMac or CMAL over-egging the requirements for some reason? And there was certainly never ever a requirement for 1,000 people. And even if there were, and it is such a rare event that a lot fewer would have been fine, it would have been much more in keeping with the amount of people they would expect to deal with normally. And so there was no real reason for wanting these two ferries to be as capacious in terms of numbers as they were, and there's never been an explanation as to why they want these numbers. It all seems to be some arbitrary figure. Nobody ever said why, so that's something that would probably need investigating, because it doesn't seem to be a number that's in any way real. It seems to be simply plucked from the air. I mean, it sounds good, 1,000 passengers. Well, so does 700, if 700 is a more accurate number. And if you say we can only carry 700 passengers and 700 book, well, the others can wait until the next sailing. You do it on a first come, first served basis. The tickets were booked in advance anyway, so there was nothing to worry about. But the other thing that came out of the committees, and this one came particularly from the Greens on the committees, was their insistence that the engines weren't standard marine fuel, which is a kind of diesel. They wanted LNG, or liquid natural gas. Now, they said they wanted it because it is much more friendly for the environment, and on first reading you'd assume that they'd be right, because it is. When it burns much cleaner. This is undoubted, and this is absolutely fine if you know, and there is no arguing with that. It is a marvellous thing. But it only does do that if you burn it in a perfect engine. If you were to do this in a laboratory and measure it in a laboratory, then oh yes, LNG burns much more cleaner than diesel. But the engines in these ferries were big diesel engines that were adapted for LNG. They are not perfect engines, and so an awful lot of the LNG that goes through these engines comes out the stack at the top unburnt. Unburnt LNG being released into the atmosphere is 80 times worse in terms of the greenhouse effect than what would normally come out under a diesel burn. And so while the principle is that LNG burns cleaner, The effect in reality is that it's actually a lot worse for the environment when your engines aren't 100% clean burning, which no big engines like this ever can be. And so the committee was sort of overwhelmed with some piece of obtuse scientific knowledge that they've read on the back of a cereal packet, but without actually looking in the real world research and doing the due diligence effectively. Of course, as a secondary problem to having the LNG engines, of course, there is the question of the storage of the gas. If it was a conventional diesel engine, you hold it down underneath the car deck in normal fuel tanks. But with liquid natural gas, you need a big cylindrical high pressure container that would usually sit more or less in the centre of the ship. This is where you would normally have the cars. So this actually takes up more car space, or you have to build a bigger ship. And of course, a bigger ship means making it wider. Now, Kevin Hobbs said increasing the beam, which is the width of the ship, improves the hydrodynamics. And that is very wrong. And this is the first time that something in the design stage has been said to the committee that is inaccurate, whether deliberately or just through error. But it is not the last. Now we have to deal with Robbie Drummond. Robbie Drummond is the CEO of CalMac. He is a man who is an expert when it comes to working out timetables and working out the charges you need to pick, how to make the thing pay and all that. He is great at running what is effectively a bus service. But he is not very good at designing ships. He does not understand how ships work. He does not understand the engineering of ships. He does not understand anything about them. But he does know how to run a bus service. Now, he said to the committee that catamarans were less stable than monohulls. Well, in fact, the complete opposite is true. Catamarans are at least 10 times more stable than monohulls. And yet he pushed for a monohull. So this is another example of the committee being told something that is untrue. Now, whether this is because in his mind he genuinely thought it was more stable, or perhaps he should have asked an expert, or if he thought it was cheaper, or if he thought he could get built quicker, who knows? That is something else that will need to be investigated, but he pushed for a monohull, and that, of course, is what they ended up with. But of course, he should have asked for the catamaran, which would have been an inherently much more stable proposition. He should not have misled the committee, whether deliberately or mistakenly. He should not have spoken, as he is not an expert. And had they known, or had they any experts with them, then those experts would have told them these things. They would have told them about the beam of the ship. They would have told them about having a catamaran rather than a monohull. And they would certainly have told them about not having LNG engines in such a vessel. And so you have all these problems. This is at the design stage. This is at the commissioning of the design stage. Now, Kenneth Gibson, we showed him as well last episode. He was the MSP who was sitting there taking all this on board. No pun intended. And you have Roy Peterson. He was also involved in all this. And when questioned about the catamaran stability issues, Robbie Drummond wrote a 23-paragraph letter to Roy Peterson, trying to explain and to justify his failed understanding, for the want of a better term, of how and why monohulls are much more stable than catamarans, which of course we know they're not. Now, this was fact-checked, and the statements were sent to Transport Scotland. They were also sent, along with this, a rational design to go with it. They decided to ignore the fact-checked corrections, and they decided to ignore the rational design. And so they proceeded with the lousy design of these CalMac ferries. Now, why they went for this monohull design still remains a mystery. Catamarans are cheaper to build, they're quicker to build, they are easier, they are better. It can be launched quite quickly, and they're inherently more stable. And yet they still went for this monohull design. That is a question for any inquiry. And that was all this has happened at the commissioning stage. Nobody has put a single nut and bolt together yet, but these errors are sitting there waiting. They made the wrong choice of passenger numbers, they made the wrong choice of engine, they made the wrong choice of fuel, and they made the wrong choice of hull type. Now, this is unsurprising, and we know now that they have had they were lied to. The committee were lied to at all stages of this commissioning. And then they tried backing it up and tried to justify why they were wrong with letters and explanations, because they couldn't admit to being wrong and having to go back to the drawing board and redo it from start, because they were working to a fixed price. Now it's time to turn our attention to this man, Jim Anderson. He is the director of vessels at Seamow. Now, I said at the beginning of this video that somebody had been exaggerating their qualifications, and this is the man in question. Now, there is something that he claims to be. He claims to be a fellow of the Royal Institute of Naval Architects. And this is a very hard thing to be. They are a very, very highly professional, highly specialised professional body. You have to have an awful lot of knowledge. Engineering knowledge, hydrodynamics knowledge. You have to be very, very good at maths and at physics. You also have to have practical experience in naval architecture. You don't just walk in and get this, unless you're Jim Anderson. Jim Anderson, at every stage, kept pushing that he was a fellow of the Royal Institute of Naval Architects. And on researching this and phoning them up, it has turned out that he actually is a fellow of the Royal Institute of Naval Architects. But that's not entirely true. Whilst he has the rights to use those letters, he is not a qualified naval architect. He is in fact an electrical engineer. He happened to have done some work on boats. He happened to have done a lot of work on boats. But he's never studied naval architecture. He's never qualified, in that he's a qualified electrical engineer, but not qualified naval architect. He's kind of got this letters after his name as sort of a grandfathering rule, sideways. He is an adjunct member. He is not a qualified naval architect. He is allowed to use the letters, but he must not describe himself as a naval architect, nor is he allowed to trade as one. But he's put those letters up front at every stage and presented himself as an expert. But he is not an expert. And all of this has been part of the problem all the way through the commissioning, and then all beyond that into the build stage of the ships. But we will deal with these in the next episode. But before we finish, we'll just come up and we'll do a quick summary. So you can see that Hull 801, which is the Glen Sannox, and Hull 802, which is the rusting hulk sitting up by the Lower Clyde right now, they were the wrong ship, the wrong size, the wrong hull, the wrong fuel. At every stage where a decision was made, it was the wrong decision. How did the committee arrive at these decisions? Well, they were lied to by people who don't really know anything about designing or building ships. And yet they were given the authority to do this. They were given the authority to tell the committee what, needed to be designed. And is it any wonder that the whole thing was starting on the wrong foot? Is it any wonder that it was always destined to end in disaster? And will it end in disaster? Of course it's going to. But we'll find out more in the next episode, where we'll be looking at the building of the ships. So thank you very much for listening. And do keep an eye out for the next episode. If you haven't subscribed, now's the excellent time to do so. And I will see you next time. Thank you very much.